As a fitness professional, you know the joy of helping others, and you know it's more than just fitness. We're training the whole person. Wellness coaching provides expertise that goes beyond fitness and nutrition. It's a holistic approach to helping others become their best selves while reaching their goals. To us, there's no greater joy than that. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified wellness coach. Go to nasm.org/wellness.
You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast with Derek Brown on the NASM Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, where we talk about tips and information that you can use to drink more mindfully. My name is Derek Brown. I'm your host. I'm an NASM certified wellness coach and the author of Mindful Mixology, a comprehensive guide to no and low alcohol cocktails. And I'm an award-winning bartender. And we're going to talk about that today because we're going to talk about making cocktails mindfully. And that means two things, but we're going to get into all of that. I want to start out by telling you a story. So the cocktail itself, which is Americans love cocktails. We always have since the first definition appears in 1806. It is in the Balance and Columbian Repository, a paper in New York at the time. And somebody wrote in asking, what is a cocktail? And the editor replied that it's with spirits, sugar, water, and bitters, which is the name of my first book, Spirit, Sugar, Water, Bitters, How the Cocktail Conquered the World. And that was his explanation. So it wasn't super well known, but Americans drank a lot back then and they continue to do so, but they drank a lot of cocktails and mixed drinks. And so that was starting to show up on the scene, but it was just one particular drink, right? So for those of you who are enterprising mixologists, for those of you who enjoy this style of drink, you might already know that that is an old fashioned, right? So the old fashioned, which is generally made with whiskey, a little bit of sugar, bitters, and an orange peel, or sometimes with a cherry and an orange muddled, depending on where you're at and what style. And that cocktail is something that's pretty common, but it was originally the cocktail, and it didn't matter what spirit you used. You could put anything in there. Sometimes there were gin cocktails and brandy cocktails, but they all followed a similar pattern, and they all had alcohol. And in a way, you would think that that means that the cocktail definitively has alcohol, even though today the drinks that we refer to as a cocktail are very different than that initial one, right? Somebody at some point came in and said, I'll take one of those cocktails. Then over time, they said, I'll take one of those old fashioned cocktails. And they said, I'll take one of those old fashions. And that's pretty much how the old fashioned got its name. And then the word itself, cocktail, merged into this entire category that included sours, punches, flips, all the different styles of drinks that Americans, and it started to go throughout the world, started drinking. Now, like I said, you'd think that that means it's definitively with alcohol. However, there is an earlier mention of the word cocktail in relationship to a drink. And that is in 1790s. And it is in a London paper called the Morning Gazetteer. And it is in reference to the prime minister at the time, Mr. Pitt. And it was found by Jared Brown and Anastasia Miller. And they found this reference, and it essentially says a cocktail, and in parentheses says vulgarly called ginger. We're going to get into that story in a minute. But interestingly enough, of all of the drinks, because other drinks with alcohol are mentioned, including like sherry and bitters or gin and bitters or something like that, this is the least expensive drink in that lineup, which led historian David Wondrich to suggest that it may not have contained alcohol, which is just a very interesting note. Obviously, we don't, like I said, we don't really define the cocktail by its original incarnation. It's a category now, and so it's fair to say non-alcoholic cocktails. But to think that the original one might not have included alcohol, I think is interesting, and it shows us that, you know, there is diversity within this drink even to begin with. However, let's get to the vulgarly called ginger, because I told you I was going to talk about that when I mentioned it. And at this point, this is a not safe for work conversation. It's not incredibly vulgar as it implies, but it's maybe a little bit. And essentially, the word cocktail, we have good historical evidence, was a practice that horse owners would use, especially around race horses, I think, in which now listen, before I continue, there are lots of definitions out there of the cocktail, and origination myths, we'll call them, right? So if you've ever been in a tour in New Orleans, they're going to tell you that's Antoine Amédée Peychaud, and he, put it in a cocotier, which is a egg cup, and that was called a cocktail. Some people say that you stir it with a rooster feather. All of these are not, haven't been proven to be true at all. But this one is clear. The word cocktail comes from a practice in which they would insert a piece of ginger into the rectum of a horse, a practice called figging. Now, I highly recommend that you do not Google that, because that is not going to get you to the word cocktail. It is going to send you to an entirely different place. But this practice was a way that they would pep up the horse. I mean, honestly, anybody would be more peppy under these circumstances. And so I guess in not exactly steroids per se, but this is a way to increase the horse's, vigor, and maybe make it run faster, maybe look a little bit, more active when somebody was going to buy the horse, et cetera, et cetera. But I won't linger on that story, because obviously it's a weird one. But the word cocktail clearly means that. And the first mention of the cocktail includes, in parentheses, vulgarly called ginger. So they're clearly making fun of the president at the time, sorry, I'm caught up in our own presidential politics. We're talking about England, the prime minister. It's the prime minister at the time. They're making fun of him by referring to him as ordering a cocktail vulgarly called ginger. Okay. But it is clear that the first cocktail did include ginger. It is not clear whether it included alcohol. And I think that that's an interesting point, and one that we're going to put a pin in that, because as we're talking about what makes a cocktail and what makes a non-alcoholic cocktail, we're going to reference that. But let me talk about this theory that I came up with in my book. My book, Mindful Mixology, A Comprehensive Guide to No and Low Alcohol Cocktails, includes a small theory about how to make a cocktail from a sensory perspective, right? So think about that definition: spirit, sugar, water, bitters. That's a historical definition. But from a sensory evaluation or sensory qualities, what makes a cocktail? And I came up with 4 things that I think are clear sensory aspects of a cocktail. I mean, because really, if you're talking about non-alcoholic cocktails, what would distinguish iced tea from a cocktail if they both don't have alcohol? So that's why I came up with this theory, and I think it's could be improved upon. I certainly welcome comments on, but this is what I initially came up with. And so the first part of it is that cocktails exhibit intensity of flavor, right? So they're very flavorful. When you drink a cocktail, you don't mistake it for something else. That's a cocktail, right? If you pick it up and you picked it up instead of a glass of water or iced tea, that's a cocktail. There's a bite to it, which I call piquancy, right? So that bite is, the sort of thing when you're taking a shot of whiskey or tequila and you slam your hand on the table. That's the bite. And that comes from alcohol, that comes from bitterness, that comes from a number of things. But alcohol obviously is part of that. Then you have something I call volume or length, and that is the amount of the drink that's not taken up by juice or sugar. One of the complaints about the mocktail era, right? This period of time where everything, if it was non-alcoholic, was just juice and sugar and soda. It's a fair complaint, right? I mean, the Shirley Temple is a fine drink, but not what I would call a healthy or adult drink. So I get it. People don't enjoy that. I don't necessarily enjoy that, except on occasion. Just like on occasion, I enjoy ice cream, but not something that I would want to sit down at a bar and drink. So as far as the that volume or length, that means that there has to be additional ingredients besides sugar and juice. And then lastly, there's a certain texture to the cocktail, right? When you taste it, there's a richness, a mouthfeel. That's what sometimes sommeliers will call it. And it's the certain texture of the liquid, right? Water is a different texture than, let's say, cream. And somewhere in between there is the cocktail texture. And so those sensory um, qualities are all really important when you're creating either a cocktail with alcohol or without alcohol. And why I mention that is because if you want to learn how to make cocktails, that's where you start. You start thinking about it in terms of these different categories and what you can use to achieve each one of those sensory characteristics. So I'm going to start with intensity of flavor and kind of crossover with piquancy, because there's lots of great ingredients you can use for that. Now, obviously, you can use alcohol, and we're going to talk about low alcohol cocktails in a minute. But I think there's lots of recipes out there for cocktails with alcohol and less recipes out there for non-alcoholic cocktails. And since we're talking about mindful drinking, I want to start by talking about the non-alcoholic kind. And so when you're making a non-alcoholic cocktail, what are you going to use as the base? That's the obvious question. And one easy answer is that there are non-alcoholic spirits that have been distilled even. So they go through a similar process to what alcohol goes through, and they remove the alcohol. And so in that way, you get a lot of the aromatic qualities, you get some of the body and some of the congeners and different qualities that make up the spirit. And that gives you that, base to make a cocktail. So some of them are even analog products, right? Which means that they are just like the uh, original in some ways. Now, I want to put an asterisk there because they're not. They're ultimately non-alcoholic, and it says so on the label. So what do they not taste like? You've guessed it. They don't taste like alcohol because they can't, because they don't have alcohol. Alcohol is a magic molecule. And so in itself, you're not going to find anything quite like it. But a lot of these products are still really, really good in making cocktails. So when you taste them by themselves, you might not enjoy just sipping them like you would a whiskey or a cognac or something like that, but you can enjoy mixing them into cocktails. There's like a bourbon alternative that I really enjoy that is distilled and it has all of those flavors, the vanilla, the caramel, all the richness that you get from a bourbon, but obviously it's not bourbon. It has some of the wood characteristics, all of that, and it can make a great whiskey sour, old fashioned, what have you. But it is going to be necessarily thinner and not quite as has the piquancy or bite. So that's where these sensory characteristics become really important, because you kind of have to fill in the gaps, right? So that goes along with this intensity of flavor in general. Let's say that you start with one of these spirits. You can add other ingredients that are going to help it to be more rich and more intense and more piquant. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, and my name is Derek Brown, your host, and we're talking today about mindful mixology. And I'm getting into some of the sensory characteristics of what you can use to make great non-alcoholic cocktails. Very shortly, we're going to also talk about low alcohol cocktails. And so as far as non-alcoholic, you can use non-alcoholic spirits. You can supplement them a little bit by using other ingredients. One ingredient I really like to use is vinegar, right? And especially apple cider vinegar. Now, apple cider vinegar is a byproduct of alcohol. So in that way, and it doesn't have any alcohol in it, but it is a byproduct of alcohol, which means it has some of the same flavors and intensity. And clearly, if you've ever done a shot of vinegar, don't do a shot of vinegar. Just in case you have at any point, even if you sipped it, it's really intense and can kind of have that throat burning effect. You don't want too much of it. So if you are using it, you're usually using a bar spoon at a time, a teaspoon at a time. That's about it. And that adds some flavor, intensity, all of that. Another thing that I really like to use is, not surprisingly, going back to the original story, is ginger. So I make a great ginger syrup. It's in my book. You can buy ginger syrups online, or I'm happy to also post a recipe. Maybe I'll put the recipe in the comments. It's really easy to make, but I'm going to tell you right now, you can just take sugar, water in equal parts. Boil the water, dissolve the sugar, cut up some ginger, leave the skin on. I think the skin adds some flavors to it that are really important, some earthy characteristics. Just make sure it's washed and chop it up and throw it in there and let it sit in the hot, simple syrup and cool down together. That will extract the ginger flavor. And the finer you cut up the ginger and the more ginger you put in there, the more intense the flavor. So you can actually control to some degree the amount of flavor that you have out of that ginger syrup. But certainly another thing that you can do is if you want to cut down on the syrup aspect of a little bit, you can also juice the ginger. Now you'll probably need a juicer for that, but you can juice the ginger and that gives a really spicy, hot flavor and especially adds to that intensity of flavor / piquancy. Another thing that I really like to use is tea, and I use all kinds of tea. I use green tea. I use black tea. I use different tisanes, which essentially, like recently, I used a sorrel ginger tea in a cocktail in a spritz that worked out really, really well. And the tea, the secret from my perspective to making it better is to double steep it. So there's two methods to that. One is to add more material, and aka if it says, 1 bag, add 2 bags, or just increase the length of time. Both of those things are going to create a more intense flavor. And don't worry if it's not sippable on its own. You don't want it to be. That's the point. To be a base ingredient and have intensity of flavor and piquancy, it needs to be intense. So it's okay. It's going to be a little thinner, and we're going to talk about how we can get to that texture in a moment. But tea makes a really great base. Adjacent to that is kombucha, because kombucha is ultimately made of tea as well. So kombucha is like that vinegar tea combo, and that makes a really wonderful combination. There are, of course, I meant to add, there are non-alcoholic wines and non-alcoholic beers that work great, and there are plenty of cocktails that include non-alcoholic wines and beers. You have the champagne cocktail, which is just essentially a sugar cube doused in aromatic bitters with champagne. You have the spritz, which I mentioned, which has usually Prosecco, but you can use non-alcoholic sparkling wine. And of course, there's things like the michelada that is a beer-based drink that you can make as well. So all of those are bases that you can use that add to both the intensity of flavor and piquancy. The second part, the length, or I'm sorry, this is really the third part because we've already kind of talked about the piquancy. Well, let's get into that just a little bit more. I will add that bitterness and spice can help. So using aromatic bitters, and there's some really great non-alcoholic aromatic bitters. Bitters don't necessarily need to be with alcohol. And for those of you who are scratching your head and wondering what are bitters, they are essentially very concentrated herbal infusions that have, kind of citrus peels and some bittering agent like gentian or, what have you, different bittering substances. And those are essentially like the salt and pepper of the cocktail world. So if you remember going all the way back to what is the definition of a cocktail? Spirit, sugar, bitters, water, right? So the bitters is actually an essential part of a cocktail, at least historically speaking. And so you can still use bitters. That's absolutely a great way to do it. And that adds to the piquancy. Some people might think spice, especially when we're talking about capsicum, right? And some of the hot peppers. That can be really great, and it can be just awful. I've had so many cocktails that are just absolutely too spicy, like a hot sauce and bourbon can go together. There is a cocktail I really love where they go together called the Aztec's Mark, but very rarely do they go together. So you have to be a little careful there. So I think it's important if you are using cayenne, that does work, but use it in a small, capsicum cayenne, then use it in a small dose so that just gives enough burn and bite that it feels like the alcohol, but doesn't necessarily overwhelm the palate. So that's a little bit about the piquancy. The length and volume, which is the third part of it, can be achieved by all of those different things that I mentioned, including by stretching it out with soda water, bitters, using non-alcoholic beer, spirits, wine, tea, etc. All of those can create something besides sugar and juice. And then lastly, the texture, which is sort of harder to replicate, can be achieved either in those ingredients along the way, but also there's two things that I used to cheat with that I'm going to share with you. One is something called aquafaba. So aquafaba is a fancy way of saying chickpea water, and I literally get it from a can. So I go to the store, I buy a can of beans, I open it and pour out the beans, make hummus with it later, and use the aquafaba or the water to thicken and add foam to the drink. So there's certain drinks that I'll make that use that. And another one that's common is egg whites. So those are already existing cocktails. Depending on which one you prefer. Some people are plant-based, some people are allergic to eggs. So that's why I usually use aquafaba. Another little secret is salt tincture, which is really just salt water, right? I take 4 parts of water to 1 part salt and shake it until the salt dissolves, or stir it until the salt dissolves. And then you have just a few drops of it, really like 6 to 8 drops, can add texture to the drink and also reduce bitterness and increase the viscosity, but also the roundness or the perceptual roundness of it, which is kind of interesting. It's a little science trick. It doesn't taste it doesn't taste sweet. I mean, rewind. It does not taste salty if you use it in small doses. So don't go too heavy, but it does add all of that stuff, which is really cool. So let me put this all together in a cocktail that I made called the pinch hitter, because right now there's all these parts and it might be confusing, especially if you're new to making cocktails. I want to just put it all in context. So I created a drink called the pinch hitter, which is really lemonade, right? And that's kind of a joke. People say, oh, if you're not drinking, cocktails with alcohol, you're either drinking soda or lemonade. But in this case, it's lemonade plus, right? I add all these ingredients to it to make it a non-alcoholic sour, a sour being a drink like a margarita or daiquiri, or any sour drink. A sidecar is another one. And so what I do is I start with fresh lemon juice. That really does make a difference. So don't use sour mix, use fresh lemon juice. You can squeeze it. It's not hard. And add ginger syrup, which gives it a little bit of intensity of flavor and piquancy. I use a spoonful of apple cider vinegar because that gives it a little bit of bite. A salt tincture, just 8 drops, and aquafaba. And then I shake that with ice. Okay. And I should have brought my shaker so I can demonstrate shaking, but I will tell you this. My book talks about shaking, and also I have a Substack as well called Positive Damage that you can check out to get more information about that stuff. This isn't necessarily a mixology show, but I do want to share some of these great drinks. And I think most of you will get it. You put ice in it, you put the shaker, and then shake it back and forth. And that's for about 15 seconds. That's the way to do it. So once you do that, you pour it out into a chilled cocktail glass, a coupe or a martini glass, as you prefer. And I think it's really important to use the proper glassware, because a lot of the cocktail itself is the visual aspect of it, right? We taste first with our eyes. And so I think that when we're looking at that and we're making it, it really is more inviting when it's in a beautiful glassware with a nice garnish, all of that. So you want to make sure that you at least put some effort into that. You have a nice chilled glassware. You can take a lemon peel about 3 inches long, about 3/4 of an inch wide, twist it on top of it, or use a wheel, a lemon wheel if you want. Either one of those makes a nice garnish. And all of a sudden you have this beautiful non-alcoholic sour. And it does not go past me that it is in fact all of these really easy to get ingredients from a grocery store. So you could go to your grocery store right now, go pick up all those ingredients and make it. It's very easy. So that there are, like I mentioned, all of these ingredients that you can buy the non-alcoholic spirits. But if you really did want to make a very simple non-alcoholic drink, this pinch hitter is, it'll cost, I don't know, $1 or so to make, and you're going to have a wonderful drink. So there's something for everyone there. As far as low alcohol cocktails, that becomes a little bit more complicated because you have to ask yourself, what does low mean, right? It is actually not very precise of a word because it doesn't refer to an exact number. It just means in relationship to something else, right? So if in terms of beer, there's a actual definition of what low alcohol beer is. That's, I believe, 2.5 ABV, alcohol by volume. And so that means there's the percentage of alcohol that's in the product, right? And a more standard beer that you get, now this can range, but a more standard beer is going to be around 5% ABV. So that's about half. So that's where I usually go when I think of low alcohol. That means that it's about half of what the usual product is, right? So with wine, and we have an entire episode where we talk about ABV, so you can go back and listen to that. I think that that's an important concept to learn, but really most of you probably already understand it's the volume. It's the, volume that matters, but it's the percentage of alcohol that's in the cocktail. Let's say that you had 100 red cups lined up, and for a 5% beer, that means 5 of those cups would be full of alcohol. The rest would be full of, if it was a beer, water, hops, barley, etc. So that's the basic concept. So in terms of a wine, wines are usually about, let's say, anywhere between 11 to 16% alcohol. So let's settle on 14% and say that then a low alcohol wine to me is probably going to be half of that, about 7% or less. Although you'll see low alcohol wines coming in at all different percentages. That one is not legally defined. And when it comes to spirits, it's even more confusing. But let's say that you're drinking something like soju, which is a Japanese, and there's soju, which is a Korean spirit. Those can come in around 20 to 30% alcohol, which is a lot less than, vodka, tequila, bourbon, which range from 40 to 60% ABV. So it really is dependent on those things. But when you're making a cocktail, it's even more confusing because you're adding in ingredients without alcohol. So what is the final ABV content? Well, I'm going to make it easy for you. I have a calculator online through Epicurious that I created with Maggie Hoffman that's called the ABV calculator. So you can look that up. You can Google that and find a link to it and put in all your ingredients, and you'll see the exact percentage of alcohol that it includes the non-alcoholic ingredients and the dilution from water. Maybe I missed this, but if you go back to the spirit, sugar, water, bitters definition, where's the water come from? It comes from shaking, stirring, etc., right? The ice. So that's adding water to the drink. And so that's something you want to calculate when you're calculating the ABV. And ultimately, all of this is also dependent on the volume too, because if you had a 40% ABV shot of vodka and you had a pitcher of beer that's 5%, obviously there's technically less alcohol in the shot of vodka than that entire pitcher. So that's one thing to consider. Essentially a 1.5 ounce shot of 40% alcohol is the same as a 12 ounce beer, is the same as a 5 ounce glass of wine. All those are roughly equivalent, even though they have different ABVs. So low alcohol is difficult, but one of the easiest ways to do it, so you don't really have to go through all that math, is let's say that you are making a whiskey sour and you're using bourbon. You could easily get that bourbon alternative and you could split it in half, and all of a sudden you have lowered the alcohol by volume by half, right? So if the measurement is 1.5 ounces, which is a common measurement for a base of cocktails, it's usually 1.5 to 2 ounces. You can do 0.75 of the bourbon and 0.75 of the bourbon alternative, and it's going to be delicious. It's going to work great. Same with a gin alternative, same with whatever other analog spirit that you want to use. That makes it exceedingly simple to do. Another thing that you can do is use wine and beer. right? We mentioned those in terms of non-alcoholic, but you can make a michelada or you can make a champagne cocktail, and those are lower alcohol than a Manhattan or a martini, which are, using fully distilled products that are 40% alcohol or more. And so these are going to be higher than, sort of the non-alcoholic spirits and some of the lower alcohol spirits, but they won't be higher than your usual cocktail. So if you're sitting down in the evening, you're used to having this specific cocktail and you just want to cut it in half, or you want to replace it with something that has wine and beer, that's a really easy lift to make a cocktail that's low alcohol. And after all, you can use this in any combination you want. I mean, I think that's part of what mindful drinking is about, is this, optionality. The fact that you can have a non-alcoholic drink, then you can have a low alcohol drink, then you can go back to a non-alcoholic drink, and you can do something that I think is a wonderful term that I heard before called tempo drinking, which means that you're kind of just staying in this place where you're not getting to a place of intoxication. You're enjoying the cocktail, you're enjoying the company, you're enjoying the people around you, the mood, whatever it is, but you're not necessarily getting sloshed, which is wonderful, right? So I think that's a much more enjoyable way to approach a social evening and connect with other people. That's about all that I wanted to say about mindful mixology. There's so much more that we can get into. Obviously, there's a great book about that, which I recommend. And there are other good books about it too that you can check out. Even though there's not as many recipes for non-alcoholic drinks yet, there are a lot of recipes out there, and there are some bars and restaurants that are doing great work. I helped to open a bar in Los Angeles called Stay, which is in Chinatown, fantastic, entirely non-alcoholic bar, which I think did a great job of executing the drinks, and they have a beautiful environment. There's bars in Washington, D.C., Binge Bar, and bars in New York, Hecate, or Hecate, sorry. I think I mispronounced that. And, all throughout the country, you can see these great bars that are non-alcoholic if you want to step into it. But you can always just check with your bartender and say, I want something non-alcoholic, or I want something low alcohol, and people are getting better at doing it. So inquire and see what you can get. Not everyone's going to make a great non-alcoholic cocktail, but not everybody makes a great cocktail to begin with. So that's okay. You just have to pick the right bartender on the right shift and the right night and the right bar. So the only other thing that I want to add to this is something that I included in my book that I think is a really important thing. The cocktail is a social drink. It's something that we do together. It's something that I love to make for other people, and I sometimes make for myself. But I believe that the best part of the cocktail isn't even how it tastes, although you definitely want to make it taste delicious. The best part of it is sharing it with other people. And so whenever you make a cocktail, whenever you apply these techniques, let's say that you got excited about what we talked about today, you're going to make the pinch hitter, you're going to make some variation, you're going to michelada, whatever it is, then the best part of it is not sitting alone and drinking it by yourself. That's nice if you want to do connoisseurship and you really want to focus on, learning about it. But I think sharing it with others is what it's all about. And that's what I've always loved about bartending, being the person who can share cocktails with other people. So I hope you enjoy that too. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really love to hear from you. So please do not hesitate to reach out by commenting on this podcast or sending us an email. Liking, sharing, all of that is great for us. We're always happy when you participate, and we're so grateful that you joined us today. And as always, here's to drinking mindfully.